Good morning, everyone, and thank you for tuning in to our webinar today. My name is Brian, and for those of you who don't know about us, we are a government-owned organization in Singapore that invests in and helps to build deep tech startups, talent, and communities. At SGInnovate, our work involves connecting the global deep tech ecosystem, working with entrepreneurial scientists to bring their innovative research from lab to market, as well as to help develop deep tech talent. Today's event, the transformative potential of AI in drug discovery, is presented by SGInnovate. Today, we have a panel of amazing experts in this field who will be able to share their insights on the critical focus and priorities in delivering the promise of AI for drug discovery. I would like to encourage our audience here today to share their thoughts on this topic and engage with our speakers by using the Q&A box below. And now, with no further ado, I will pass on the time to Adrian, who is the Global Head of Global Business Development Lead at Access Health International. Adrian, please.
Thank you, Brian, and thank you everyone who is joining today. And I'm very excited to be having this discussion today with three experts in the use of artificial intelligence in drug discovery. And so I'm going to start off by just letting each of our panelists today introduce themselves, their work, and the organizations that they're working for. So Dean, I'm going to start with you, Professor Dean Ho at National University of Singapore. Can you start by introducing yourself?
Great, thank you so much for the kind introduction. It's great to be here, and thanks to all the attendees for joining us today. Thanks to SGInnovate, and thanks to Adrian for moderating this panel. So I am the director of the Institute for Digital Medicine, also known as Wisdom, at NUS Medicine. I'm also the director of the N1 Institute for Health, as well as head of department of biomedical engineering at the National University of Singapore. And to sum things up, the institutes that I direct, we are clinical stage platforms where we do two key things. We individualize the development of treatment regimens for patients. Many types of cancers. We also look at optimizing combinations for infectious diseases. In particular, we've looked at SARS-CoV-2. We also look at antimicrobial resistance. When I mentioned clinical stage, our institutes combined with partners such as the Cancer Science Institute of Singapore probably have about 10 active clinical trials, and these are all interventional. And they range from rapidly designing combinations for patients, and then these combinations are in fact administered to the patients. Or we look at dynamic dose optimization, where we recruit cancer patients and we modulate the dosing of their regimens to sustainably and continue the optimization of their treatment for the entire duration of their care. And so it's a highly interdisciplinary team that ranges from engineers to clinicians, but beyond that, to behavioral scientists, those who work in healthcare economics, all the way to those in the payer side of the ecosystem. So it really spans the entire continuum to ensure that we can bridge ideation with validation of our technologies all the way towards adoption. It's great to be here today. Thanks.
Thank you very much. And I am now going to ask Dr. Sun Miao to please introduce herself from the Experimental Drug Discovery Center.
Yeah. Hi, thank you. Thank you, Adrian, the moderator, for having the introduction. And then, of course, thank you, SGInnovate, for organizing the event. And then thank you all for joining us in this session. So as Adrian mentioned, I work in the Experimental Drug Development Center in Singapore. I was the head of computational biology, also leading the overall computational and data strategy and initiatives in Eddc. So maybe just a little bit about Eddc for those of you who are not familiar. We are the national drug development platform hosted by A*STAR in Singapore. And then essentially, Eddc have two major missions. One is we'd like to be the translator to really help to translate all the great sciences that's happening here in Singapore, to really translate them into great medicines, meaning all the way across preclinical to clinical program to be real of therapeutic use. And then in doing so, we work very closely with both public sectors as well as industry partners. And then we try to offer our expert know-how in this particular area, as well as the full range of capabilities across the pipeline. And then we also have another role as sort of the catalyzer to really help to nurture the local biotech scene in Singapore. Again, we work very closely in partnership with different biotech companies. And then we also work very closely with pharmaceutical players to understand their needs and then to see if there is synergy in any of the activities. And then as my role, as you are aware, the application of big data and all these AI machine learning data analytics approaches is really transforming different aspects of different industries, including the therapeutic drug discovery processes. So it is my role to look into, to evaluate the activities in-house, and then to see where we should be putting more application into it to really coming up with smart answers to solve some of the very challenging questions. Yeah, so I'm very happy to be here, and I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you very much. And last but not least, Jeffrey Liu, who's the co-founder and CEO of Engine Biosciences. Please introduce yourself and Engine Biosciences for us.
Great. Thank you for the introduction, Adrian. And thanks to SGInnovate for the invitation. And everyone, thank you for your time today. I'm Jeff, as Adrian mentioned. I'm the CEO, co-founder of a company called Engine Biosciences. So we're based in Singapore in the US. We are a drug discovery company that is based on a foundational platform that does utilize computational methods, including machine learning-based approaches for the identification of targets and biomarkers. And we pair that together with a high-throughput experimental functional genomics platform that creates purpose-built data sets that help train our algorithms and ultimately provide rapid and scalable validation of predictions that we generate. And we were inspired by kind of the advent and really the success of new therapeutics that have been developed and are applied in a precision medicine context over the past couple of decades. So really what we kind of focused on our applications platform are on rigorously interrogating gene networks to identify next generation precision medicines. Much of our work to date has been done in oncology, where we've had a great progress in identifying many different new drug targets in the context of specific genetic vulnerabilities that are in patient tumor cells. And those serve as our patient selection biomarkers, for which we have both drug targets and increasingly are developing actual therapeutic compounds to be addressing. So we've nicely progressed since founding several years back, and grown the team nicely, and learned a lot of things along the way about some of the opportunities and potential and also challenges in applying tools like artificial intelligence in the workflow. So happy to be speaking on the panel today to discuss this exciting topic further.
Great, thank you so much. And one thing I want to start off with is, when we talk about the use of artificial intelligence in drug discovery, that can mean many things. And each person in the audience might be coming to this session today with a notion of what that means. So in order to establish this baseline and to look across all of its applications, Professor Ho, if you could please just explain, how is artificial intelligence being used, and what are the myriad applications of it for drug discovery?
Thanks so much. It's a great question, an important one, because I think when we think about AI and drug discovery, as you mentioned, it means different things to different people. And it's important to note that the process of discovering a new candidate therapy and the process of advancing that forward into in vitro validation, in vivo validation, human validation, deployment, it's this workflow comprised of different segments involving different stakeholders, and AI can impact all of them. And in fact, I think it's critical to note that all of these segments need to be addressed, optimized, and then seamlessly integrated in order to truly realize this workflow where we can advance therapies beyond discovery all the way through to deployment. In discovery, a lot of amazing work when we see Eddc and Engine Biosciences and many in the community working in this space to help advance the development of new candidates or to discover new targets from which candidates can be developed as well. After that, there's some interesting outcomes, right? In some cases, when we look at pharma, there's a lot of therapies where if you kind of do a standard screen, nothing happens, right? There does not appear to be a lot of, say, in vitro activity. But if you were to combine this asset with another drug and another drug, all at the right respective doses and ratios, et cetera, these therapies that alone may not do that much could actually be truly essential to optimizing intervention for a specific indication. And then after that's done, can we better match patients to trials? And as I mentioned earlier, can we harness things like AI to optimize dosing for patients? I'll give you one very quick example, right? We've had patients interventionally treated where when given a specific regimen, they appear to not respond, which is very common, by the way, in cancer therapy. And then you move them on to something else. It's perceived that this regimen doesn't work. But just by tweaking the dose of the regimen, not by changing the drugs, just by tweaking the dose, patients can appear to switch from non-response to response. So what does this mean? First of all, the patient's being helped. But secondly, you have this regimen comprised of these therapies that actually did work. They were capable of working. So what we've spanned was discovery, all the way to validation and combo design and development, all the way to clinical validation. When we think about AI, it can impact all of these segments. And in fact, we really need to think about all of them to make these new workflows a reality.
Thank you for giving us that overview. I have one question actually, I'm going to ask this both to Dr. Mao and to Jeff as well, is, you mentioned about how you're prioritizing different diseases to apply artificial intelligence to. How do you go about that process of prioritization? Especially with the work that Eddc is doing and the multitude of partners that you have, obviously you're looking at across quite a broad swath of diseases and potential therapeutic areas. So can you speak to us a little bit more about that?
So I guess I can go first. So definitely prioritization is a very important key factor because there are so many things to do and then that can be done. So there are a number of factors we sort of look at together. So as you mentioned, we work very closely to a lot of different partners, right? So essentially we identify, first of all, what are the array of questions we are having gaps that we'd like to be addressed by this. And then we assess to match who are the partners who can potentially help us on this. And then so there is a capability versus problem mesh over there. And then in addition, we also look into how critical is the problem. So is it something good to have, or is something that's really hindering us across the board in multiple potentially our efforts? If that's something that if we can facilitate the development that we can apply across the board, that's something, of course, that will be prioritized. And then as Eddc, we try to prioritize based also on the factor of like how much is important to Singapore for the local ecosystem. So we really look for areas that we have a strength, or we have sort of a niche. There is a differentiation factor, or this is something of particular importance to Asian population, which will sort of give us the differentiation factor across the board in this particular area. Yeah. And I guess in addition, some other important factor we consider is also there is this practicality issue that we need to take into consideration. So it can be a very exciting problem, but it will take like 10 years to solve. Then is it something we will sort of put it to do now, or is something we will slowly build a relationship? And then we maybe will partner with the public sector, like research partners, to really develop for the greater improvement in science. But maybe it's not something we will be super high prioritized on our list of action items. Yeah. So I hope that gives some sort of a perspective in this.
It does. That's very helpful. There's, as you mentioned, a myriad of considerations. And Jeff, you had mentioned that there's a lot of, you've had a lot of early success around oncology, but then also we're looking at neurogeneration as well.
Yeah, that's right. I think we're excited to have seen that the platform can apply in multiple disease areas, including those two. So I guess as we think about it, our context is we're a venture-backed company, right? So what that means is we have to think a lot about kind of what is ultimately some of the highest impact, but also the risk of what that type of work that we undertake. And so I think oncology and neurodegeneration as two examples are areas where we assess certainly from a clinical need in certain areas within that it's very high, right? So that helps us. But then we also need to think about practically kind of what can we execute towards generating some really kind of important inflections, milestones, and events during the time frame that we have as kind of a private sector company. And so as we think about kind of disease selection, or broadly into general therapeutic areas like cancer and neurodegeneration, or then kind of thinking further about which cancer types do we want to go after, which type of neurodegenerative diseases do we want to go after. I think that's where a lot of those kind of practical considerations enter the fray. From the aspect of thinking about applications of computational methods, ultimately it depends a lot on availability of data sets, whether they are pre-existing and good quality for us to actually use to generate kind of the meaningful discovery results, or can we also generate some of those data sets ourselves in good experimental or systems? So are the models good? Can we run the experiments? Are those experiments going to be meaningful if they're designed well? So all those things come into play in terms of just thinking about how we prioritize. And as a company, you always think a lot about competition and just making sure that we're in an area that is competition is one sort. It's actually sometimes nice to see that there's activity in your area, but of course you want to know that you can do something that is ultimately going to be a differentiator for successful. So that sort of enters the picture as well in terms of how we prioritize.
And one thing that we've thank you for sharing more information on that. And one thing that we had discussed earlier on an earlier conversation is that one of the benefits of applying AI to drug discovery is being able to cut the costs and the time that is incurred in drug discovery, and looking at what its applications are to maybe the less profitable diseases. And so, looking at things like neglected tropical diseases or conditions that do not have typically as high of a price tag associated with treating them, but have are impacting a lot of people. So looking at the mortality and morbidity data. And so what is that potential application of using AI for things like NTDs or other diseases that maybe we aren't seeing, as much drug discovery happening without AI? And I'm asking this of everyone. And also, what is the role of innovative partnerships in developing these types of drugs as well?
Yeah, maybe I'll chime in areas like antimicrobial resistance, where if we look at a lot of the efforts that are out there, the discovery of novel agents is maybe a little bit less active compared to a lot of the other indications. And so the other routes being pursued are in repurposing in this space, in the development of combinations. So this is an area we've started looking into with wonderful partners at NUS and beyond. Because if you look at some of the previous examples, you've got companies that are developing new therapies, taking them through to approval, and then the companies aren't around anymore. In terms of their success in industry, it's been challenged in these areas. And so one area we're looking at is to look at optimized repurposing, which isn't primarily looking at a monotherapy that from another indication that can be just applied to AMR, but it's to really interrogate these huge parameter spaces of different combinations that can be developed to rapidly realize these combinations. And when we talk about time, if we even look at COVID, right, a lot of different therapies were studied, and some of them, the trials did not yield results until months upon months later, only to have negative readouts. And then beyond it not appearing to work well for the patients, we often don't think about those drugs anymore. If it fails a trial, never think about it again, when in reality, if these therapies could have maybe been put into combinations that were developed a different way, like with AI-based optimization, we would have had a larger arsenal to consider, spend less time, and sometimes we're taking 2 or 3 weeks, and we are producing these lists of tens of thousands of combinations with actual data, optimization data, and not only prioritizing which drugs could be useful for patients, but then deprioritizing therapies as well, because time is limited in the cases of pandemics or in areas like AMR, and resources are limited too. The final thing I'll say is data, right? If we want to ensure that our work in AMR is accessible, it's actionable, broadly applicable to different communities around the world, one thing to note is that we actually don't use pre-existing data to make these predictions. We prospectively run experiments on relevant models to strategically build the data sets that represent these trillion different data points that we're going to need. We don't need a trillion experiments. We need maybe a few hundred experiments. So we ensure that this prospective building of the data ensures that we are developing regimens that are in fact representative and actionable for different communities, because we'll just run another experiment and build data off of a relevant geography that we're working in. So I think it's good for actionability, it's good for accelerating the process, and it's good for real optimization.
Yeah, I just kind of want to chime in there and first say that I think it's great to see that there's kind of work happening in the infectious disease space. It's actually some of the initial kind of work that inspired the technology platform development pre-spin out at Engine was actually by our co-founders working on some of the problems. I wanted to kind of mention a couple of things. One is that as we think about even diseases like or just therapeutic area like cancer, I think one thing that we feel is happening is that even in areas where their drug pricing is high, and historically there's been kind of a significant amount of sales and ultimately kind of profits to the industry that have been generated that go back into fueling R&D. If you think about concepts of precision medicine, it's really about slicing the pie of the number of patients further. That's great for every individual patient because they stand a much higher chance of success in terms of their response rate. But what that means is if each drug is treating a smaller population, if the drug price doesn't go up, which is probably not going to do dramatically, then the revenue potential is lower. And that means the kind of return on investment to be adequate requires ultimately a lower kind of input cost. So we think that actually the development of all sorts of technologies that can optimize various parts of the process are important. And I would just call out that there's two elements of that I think are two elements among many, but two that are important to think about. One is, we often think about the acceleration of the time to conduct the research or come to the findings. So whether we can cut down, the several years in discovery preclinical research down by a year, 2 years, 3 years, the direct kind of cost going down, plus the kind of, as you kind of think about the opportunity cost, the cost of that time, that's significant. So that's important. But I think actually one of the perhaps something as meaningful, if not more meaningful, is just how do we kind of reduce that failure rate at the expense of later stages? Because if you really kind of think about the economics of drug discovery and development, that's really the major driver why a successful drug costs a lot. So instead of failing, 99% of the time from discovery to approval, or 90% of the time from the start of a clinical trial, if you can enrich for success by 2x, that would be pretty dramatic. And obviously, if you can get to 3x, 5x, and the data over the last 20 years show that if you can identify patient selection biomarkers and development is done in those settings, then the odds of success in the clinical stage kind of can go up by several fold. So I think that's a really powerful way of thinking about how we can actually, ultimately lower the cost and generate more medicines through approaches that hopefully do use data to good benefit.
And thank you for pointing that out. I mean, we know that in Asia, 75% of people who are diagnosed with cancer in Asia, this is from a 2017 study, either die or are bankrupt within 1 year of diagnosis. And so knowing that, oftentimes it is that cost that's keeping people from, it's many reasons why people are being diagnosed late, but that sometimes people are not completing their full treatment because of the cost. And as you're mentioning right now, if there's opportunity to bring down those costs for patients, and also by better targeting the therapies, I think that's another aspect of the time that is, worth also showcasing, as well as it's also saving time for patients. And that is time not only for treatment, but time of saved on anguish, time to move on to healing, and that is, I think that's one thing that, each of you have touched upon as well, is that this is a tool for providing person-centered care, as closely as we can. So, while we talk about precision medicine, is making sure that the resources are, that AI is being used to ensure that resources are making care as person-centered as possible. A couple of you have also mentioned, when we look at the economics of this as well, when we talk about AI and drug discovery, oftentimes as an outsider, we're not thinking about how it's being used with health economists, how it's being used with payers. Could you help us understand a little bit more around that as well?
Yeah, one thing I'll mention is, so at the Institute for Digital Medicine, or Wisdom, the first hire we made was not an academic, but was from the payer sector. And since the bulk of what we do is to kind of bridge these AI-based or digital med-based approaches with patients and with healthcare systems, we needed these perspectives to understand how to prioritize even our clinical research programs, to make sure they had a chance to make it out of the institute and into the clinic and into the hands of the providers and the clinicians, nurses, pharmacists, and beyond. One thing I'll mention is, and to give an example, is, when we have a platform that optimizes dose. And as I mentioned earlier, we can say, find potentially more responders to treatment. Because these are patients who would normally be perceived to be non-responders and moved on to another line until they eventually advance towards hospice care. But alongside all of these studies, we pair a team of behavioral scientists to help understand the barriers and the opportunities to implementing these platforms into clinical workflows, so they can actually be used, so that they don't add work to the healthcare system. And then we add analysis to see, are we in fact generating real value for the system? Are we costing the patient less? Are we costing the healthcare system less? And beyond. So another example we had was a patient who was being driven pretty hard with high dose chemotherapy, and every single dosing point led to a readmission into the hospital. And when that happens, it impacts the healthcare system and certainly impacts the patient medically. And so in this particular case, we implemented the platform and found that at a much lower dose of a drug, in fact, this patient was perceived to be a permanent non-responder. It was time to move on to hospice. And we found this low dose of a particular drug that worked really well for the patient. So when we did the analysis, not even including reduced readmission, we were saving tens of thousands of dollars, right? And so I think that, when all of us were talking earlier, we were saying, when people hear the terms AI in drug discovery, we all kind of default and say, yeah, everybody's doing the same thing, right? You're all doing the same thing. Engine, Eddc, N1, you guys all doing the same thing. But the reality is we're working in very different segments that really need to be integrated together well. And so I think when we think about the economics of it, it's not just our units working together, but there's so many that need to enter into the discussion early so that we outline the objectives we're trying to reach. When we say, hey, we can discover new candidates faster, that's great. But at the end of the day, can we build in some more discussion with those who are able to help us bridge the other gaps that will ultimately confront us down the road? When I talk about behavioral sciences, we think to ourselves as technology developers, hey, if I come up with a drug faster and it works really well, that's everybody wins. But then are we asking the right questions of, are we interacting enough with the pharma companies? And there's a lot of activity in this space, but are we asking clinicians, do you have concerns about using a therapy that was discovered by AI? Right. And in some healthcare systems, the nurses are the final point of care, the tip of the sword to administer therapies. Do you have doubts of being the tip of the spear, giving a therapy that was discovered by AI? These discussions all need to happen early, and they represent the fact that AI in drug discovery is a very general term. Everybody, there's so many different contributions to be made. And when considering the economics of it, as I mentioned, saving costs, healthcare system, and patient, these are things we can talk about much earlier on, and we're seeing results already.
Yeah, I guess I can probably add in 2 additional comments on these topics of sort of the economics. So for instance, we do consider the economics of these drug development programs, even in as early as the target discovery stage. So I guess also with COVID, and then there is always this new exciting discussion of not only small molecule, large molecule, all the way to mRNA, all these new modalities. And then we do have internal discussion in Eddc in the sense that, shall we be exploring this new modality? However, the question of economics coming to mind, and then we think about why don't we still, what we cannot avoid, what we cannot lose is our expert know-how in, for example, the small molecule, large molecule space. And then this also has implications in the economics of the therapeutic programs. So as much as people think about, oh, okay, so era of small molecules is sort of like stabilized and things like that, but those are the ones that is able to produce cheaper drugs, if I am allowed to say that. So those are the ones that people have tried and tested and developed for decades. And then in those cases, even if you have a new drug, like in a new modality, but then when you come to talk about the dollars and the costs, you might want to still look back to see if there is a way to apply the new methodology to make the undruggable druggable by these traditional methodologies. Actually, you are saving cost. And then it will offer great benefits to the patients, not in the sense that you are curing an uncurable, but you are actually bringing a more economically sensible solution to these patients. And then also, I totally echo what Ding said about how can we really bring down, there are different angles to really bring down the cost saving through different applications of AI. So, and then I see the emergence of AI company covering many areas across the whole pipeline in the area of target discovery, in the area of drug discovery, in the area of patient stratification. But I think there is one area that remains to be a major roadblock or causing issues, which is the translatability. Like if you look at some of the statistics, 50% of the clinical trials fail because of lack of efficacy. And then a lot of this lack of efficacy could not be captured in all the rigorous preclinical, in vitro, or even animal testing. However, when we jump over from animal to the human patients, it's actually a huge gap. And then we don't have a very good solution to address it in a lot of the diseases, in a lot of the cases. But then I do believe in the power of new technologies and methodologies. So, but I still identify this as a gap. If people can come up with smarter ways of solving the issue, whether it's an AI methodology or whether it's a different like functional omics or something approaches, it will be really helping out in improving the clinical success rate and then therefore helping out with the question we are talking about right now.
Thank you. And Jeff, I'm about to ask you if you have anything to add to that. But first, I just want to remind those in the audience, if you have any questions, please put them in the Q&A. You guys are quiet in the Q&A so far. And so time to put some questions in there. Jeff, I just want to see if you have anything to add to that.
Not too much. I think fellow panelists have given some great answers on the question of economics and consumer pricing.
Okay. So one thing that was brought up and I think most people are aware of is that, the life sciences companies, the pharmaceutical companies are obviously partnering quite a bit with the data science companies that are, using AI for drug discovery. And the form of these partnerships are very different as well. But one question is, in addition to these partnerships, what are the partnerships that you want to see more of? As in the ones that you say, okay, if, what's the type of organization or the fields that you want to partner with that you haven't partnered with yet? And why?
I mean, I'll offer just a thought, the comment here. So, I mean, I think there's always, I would say two things. One is that it'd be really nice and to see certainly from a business perspective, kind of more partnering between companies. I think there's been some adoption, I think, or interest by large pharma companies or biotech companies of a certain scale to kind of dabble. Some of them have gone more aggressively into it, but there's also still a lot of kind of resistance and for various reasons, I think, to anything that's branded AI, even if it's not just algorithm. If you're branded that way, that can also cause some resistance. But I guess what I'd probably spend more time today, probably speaking about in this setting, would be, I think there's a lot of value in many places in just figuring out how we can actually use data sets that already exist or have been gathered either through public health or public sector efforts, or even private sector efforts. Just figure out how do we actually take data, which in and of itself is perceived as valuable, but if nothing comes out of it, it's not valuable at all, right? So how do we kind of take that data, ultimately have that in the hands of many smart folks who take very different approaches to try to develop insights and actionability from that? So I think there are quite a few legitimate concerns around data privacy, consent, how mechanisms in which data can be shared. But if you really step back, there's been actually a lot of data gathered, even here in Singapore, by government institutions, research projects that aren't made as widely available as they could be compared to benchmarks in other places around the world. And I feel like that's something where I'd love to certainly see sensible ways of partnering, of access, so that innovators can ultimately use what are, in many cases already exist or what is already funded to create new products.
Yeah, I'll quickly mention that something like I related to before, which was, I think, since we're looking at a lot of validation in the clinical stage of what we do, I'd like to see a lot more collaboration with the implementation sciences side. A quick example, we had a member from industry, a clinician who's run trials both on the diagnostics and therapeutic side before for a major pharma, work with us for about 6 months at our institute. And some of the most exciting discussions we had nothing to do with how to implement AI, how to execute the actual process of optimization, et cetera, and how to dose a patient. But it was a simple question of, if you're going to say recommend an AI guided dose for a patient, and this could be during a trial of an AI discovered drug as well, or it can be a point of care in a healthcare system, how long does it take? How long does it take to come up with a decision for that dose? And I told him that in the beginning, it took 30 minutes to come up with the dose. And from kind of trying to publish a journal paper, 30 minutes, you report it, it's not bad, it works, and we try to reduce that time. But in an operational setting, when it's 30 minutes per patient times 10 patients a day, even if you stagger it out, it can be a non-starter. And then now we're down to say 1 minute, right? Which is still pretty good, but the whole point of this is to make this, we're trying to make this as usable as possible in the real world. And so I think that we have this ethos at our institutes that technology alone cannot transform healthcare. And when we find a lot of the most empowering discussions that we have are those in the areas of implementation sciences and beyond. So we can really have it spelled out for us if these are the challenges we need to solve for the AI to actually become usable.
Okay, maybe also to add on to the point of validation. So we also sort of interacted with quite a number of like AI companies, both in my time in EDDC or prior to that in a pharmaceutical company setting. But what I always see is they bring in very exciting promises of the methodology with some in silico, with a lot of sometimes in silico evaluation or validation scoring matrices. But then it still remains unclear how it actually will validate in actual cases. So the interactions we had, we feel most fruitful or feel a bit more satisfying is where the company combines both their in silico AI methodology with a degree of validation in the actual biological sense or in an actual model or some sort of real experimental setups. I think people are realizing the gap of like the promises from these in silico methodologies and evaluations, but then it remains to be tested out for us to see the real value of it in actual applications. But then I don't think there is enough of that as yet. There is probably more that's doing the in silico AI part, but less of those who are actually validating for us the different pros and cons of all these AI solutions. And then I really hope to see the other sector catches up, and then we can really have a more, a more realistic and practical picture of how this AI can be applied to really address our real problems.
Thank you. So it sounds like, as you said, every institution that's working on this is working on a different part. And there needs to be, just like we talk about in healthcare in general, there needs to be integration, is we also need to see that across that drug discovery pathway and through to the validation as well. There's one question in the Q&A is how to solve the black box problem of machine learning. So the person who's asked this, if you can expound upon that a little bit more on the question, that would be helpful. And then otherwise we will actually, if you could include a little bit more detail in the question. And another question that I was going to ask as well is what is unique about how, I should say is, and then also how AI is being used in Singapore and then greater Asia as well for drug discovery? Like, why is it so important? And this is almost a rhetorical question. It's very important, but to have these companies set up in Singapore.
I'll quickly mention that I think Singapore is an amazing ecosystem because, with our ethos of technology alone cannot transform healthcare. We need to be interacting with all the stakeholders efficiently and frequently. When we talk about the way that we design combinations and can we develop clinical trials to validate these combinations, if we are going to dynamically modulate dosing as part of new trial design, what are the discussions we need to be having, right? From a regulatory perspective, implementation sciences perspective, economics perspective, et cetera. And in this particular case, the ability to engage with the stakeholders quickly can actually save lives, and it has saved lives. I think what's so unique about this ecosystem is if we need to speak to our regulators, we've had cases where we spoke to them with 1-day notice, same-day notice, with actionable guidances on helping us. If we need access to our ethics and medical review boards, if we've had cases where patients have reached out and we've had to connect 10 different offices across multiple institutions to try to get studies designed and set up that could take an eternity in certain ecosystems that got done in 2 weeks here. I think what's really exciting is just looking at the panel, right? We all interact regularly. Our institutions, the ecosystem is so accessible that time is something that we get back, right? No matter how much money is put into an operation, no matter who's involved, time is something that is essential. And because of the ease with which we can all reach each other, that is an immense advantage for being here. And the thing is, there's also different ways, as we've talked about, of implementing AI across different segments of this roadmap of ultimately bringing better care, more and better outcomes to our patients. And the fact that we can reach out to each other so much faster and get the answers that we need is truly unique.
Yeah, I wanted to add on a few things, and I just mentioned that I think to the question again, why is it important or very important for companies out in Asia or even Singapore to be working using AI or really kind of doing anything in the industry that we're talking about, right? Drug discovery or to development and ultimately delivery of new medicines. I mean, I'll just kind of ask everyone to think about if you open I guess no one opens a newspaper anymore, but if you go to your local news website, what is the news? What are the problems that you're reading about on the page? A lot of them are going to be local. So So when I'm in Singapore, I open the news, I see something very different from where I am right now in San Francisco. But fundamentally, I think if we want to solve problems that are very kind of endemic to the areas around us in Asia, obviously more than half of the world's population, et cetera, we can't expect someone halfway around the world to really be having that those issues that being top of mind. And then when we consider kind of the diversity of genetics or all the other factors that influence why diseases are and why and how we may treat them, I think it's really important that we kind of build that. We have people who are close to the problems, who are passionate about the problems, working closely with the ecosystem that that Dean described. People who work closely towards problems that feel very real and tangible to us, and that involves leveraging the types of data sets that exist that are relevant to the populations. It involves leveraging the capabilities from groups like this all around the table. It includes kind of leveraging and giving access and opportunities to the talent that we have in Singapore. So I really think it's tremendously necessary for any place, but certainly a place like Singapore and in Asia, to really have homegrown talent, homegrown technologies and companies to tackle issues that we're going to be most mindful of.
So actually, I have a quick question. In San Francisco, and I would more broadly, but really, when you're looking at the investment landscape, what are we seeing as far as, is investment into these companies increasing in Singapore and Asia? How are people talking about it from the venture capital perspective?
I mean, I'm sitting from the company hat side. I would say that I observed that certainly the last kind of 6 months to 1 year, there's been an influx of many more investors, investment firms that are looking at Singapore and saying that they want to invest in Singapore. I think that probably has materialized. I don't have the data on hand. It's obviously confounded by the fact that globally, I think we're in a challenging time from a financing point of view in general. And so I think there's probably some relative increase in interest in Singapore now. On an absolute basis, I actually think there might be an increase as well. But definitely people are kind of realizing that, hey, for various reasons already, people were kind of looking outside San Francisco and Boston because things were getting very competitive, things were getting very expensive. It's hard to, a little bit harder to figure out some of the differentiation sometimes. So they were looking further afield in places like Singapore and elsewhere.
For all three of you, what is one thing that you wish that either investors or funders understood more about your work?
For us, since we're not developing new compounds, I tell them that even good drugs administered suboptimally can yield no efficacy. And what that means is, if I think, and this kind of alludes back to this this discussion of there's a lot of ways to use AI through this workflow. And it's critical when we start with new AI discovered compounds that how we steward those forward can have a profound impact on all the way towards the end, which is the patient outcome. If a really cool drug is developed, and if it's ultimately dosed a certain way, combined a certain way, and that way is not optimal, we may miss out on really great compounds, but because the way that a study was designed, it appeared that the compound didn't work well, right? And so all of that exciting, accelerated development of that asset was suboptimally validated, right? Whether it was combined with another drug, delivered as a monotherapy, even good drugs, when we don't use them properly, we miss out on a lot. We miss out on responders. Then what happens? We think this drug is not good. Then we think we never think about this drug again. And all the cost that went into the failure is what will perpetuate this issue of high costs for drug development later on. That won't change. In the end, there's so many different facets of the process of bringing a new therapy forward that I'm hoping investors will continue to appreciate that spectrum of innovation that's needed.
Thank you. I'm going to ask that. I'm going to ask everyone to answer this question.
Yeah, I think I think with the company's hats on, there's always a lot of things that I would love to have appreciated more from the markets. But I would say that topical to today, I would say that and I think we were chatting about this a little bit earlier. Kind of spending time to really kind of appreciate some of the tangibly kind of what is the value of, if we're talking about AI as a concept. What is it actually being applied towards? Why is that valuable in the workflow that, what we do, but certainly what other companies do? And really spending the time to really understand that before, on the one hand, some people will dismiss it out of hand because, they think it's, a buzzword, it's hype, and it's a reason to actually avoid if they're hearing it, which I think is it's a very knee-jerk approach. And then others who kind of really get excited by it, but don't necessarily, kind of appreciate that, in and of itself, AI is useful as a tool, but it's really kind of the application of it. What is it designed for? Where are the data sets? Kind of where the validation? Is it actually built to iteratively improve? Because that's really the power of any kind of machine learning based method. So, really kind of asking folks to dig deep to appreciate whether there is kind of value or not in how some of the AI or machine learning technologies are being built and deployed, and to the extent that there are some differentiators, and that there is value there. Obviously, we'd love to always see kind of more capital come in to innovators who are using it for good purposes.
Okay, so I guess from the perspective of Eddc, we are sort of public funded, so our investor is sort of the government over there. So I guess what we like them to really appreciate us for is that we are essentially a very small sort of setup, like in Singapore, even though we have the backdrop of the ecosystem over there, but we are really a team of like 100 people trying to develop or advance drug development programs to compete with the really big guys out there, the big pharma companies. Like when we always do our competitive landscape analysis, and then the names we sort of put on our chart up, players like Novartis, Pfizer, like those people, those guys, you name it, like we don't have deep pockets like them, and then we have a limited amount of resources. So what we try to really do here is to play smart. We try to leverage our strengths. We try to leverage the partnership we can get from the local systems, and we try to find our angle of differentiation and then try to solve part of the problem in a very smart way so that we stand a chance to compete with them in this very competitive field. Yeah. I do think that the investors or the people, our governing board, are starting to appreciate what we managed to push through given the limited resources and the size of what we have. But of course, we always would like to be appreciated more on the kind of things we push through given what we have. Yeah.
One question from the audience is, as you all know, is that AI is very much a buzzword. Do you see the pharmaceutical, again, we mentioned earlier about the pharmaceutical companies starting to form more of these partnerships, but Jeff, you also mentioned that there's still a bit of reticence as well. How do you see this playing out as far as, do you see them accelerating kind of their willingness to adopt the use of AI in drug discovery, or is this reticence holding on?
I mean, I think it's my personal view is that compared to when I started kind of building engines, it was probably 5-6 years ago. I think there's been an increased readiness to kind of consider what AI and I really think about the new technologies can do in some aspects for pharma companies. So I see that more and more. Obviously, we'd love to see more. But although I do step back sometimes and think, if you think about pharma companies, what drives their ultimate kind of bottom line is really products, right? Drugs. So they're going to always be most motivated when they see something that near term can add potential sales into the pipeline, right? And so a lot of what we're talking about actually are technologies that inroads self-enable. And there's kind of groups and there's investment that pharma will put into that to do to use these tools to do R&D. But I think what we think is going to be probably the first step that we're seeing a lot of, and will take some time to kind of go through, is pharma really kind of buying into some of the initial outputs in terms of whether it's drugs or diagnostics or things that can fit into their pipelines to ultimately generate business for them. And if those things work out well, whether in the clinic or by some other metrics, that they might be interested in bringing in some of those technologies, they're doubling down and kind of building those out internally. So I think that it takes time. We want things to move faster. There are many reasons why it doesn't move as fast as biotech companies' willingness to adopt, or obviously venture capitalists willingness to take risk and accelerate some of this. And so I think the pace is certainly increased, and I think when you really get down to it, different companies have different priorities and think about this in ways that can be, in one case, in one hand, kind of very meaningfully aggressive in actually trying to adopt these approaches, and others could be just much more reticent in terms of how they actually bring in more technologies versus actual drugs.
Yeah, perhaps I can add on to this question, as I do work in pharma companies for 4 years in Bergen, Ingelheim in Germany, and actually it's part of my job to sort of scout for these different data solutions, and then data solutions come in, and then we internally evaluate how and where we are able to adapt them. So I definitely can feel the sense over the years. There is definitely a growing readiness to really incorporate these kind of solutions into the workflow, especially in areas we feel there is a challenge, there is a problem waiting to be resolved. However, there is always two sides to this question. On one side, some of the solutions we encountered with are really not that mature. Like I mentioned, there is still a lack of validation in the sort of to demonstrate the success, the likelihood of improvement, to demonstrate its capability, so that when we don't, at the receiving end, when we don't see the dramatic improvement, we are reluctant to replace it to sort of use this in the place of something we have shown to work in the traditional sense. But on the other hand side, of course, there is the risk, right? So there are cases where it looks really promising, but then it's not so certain because we are testing it in a situation where it's still pretty earlier in the workflow. And then it takes maybe 10 years before you actually see its value in terms of clinical success. So in these particular cases, I think I can see the variation depending on the people making the decision, and then I can see the variation from company to company. But you can definitely see the trend because we are hearing more deals being made across biotech with pharma company. We are seeing a slowly we are seeing more successful stories coming up. And then it definitely is a process for more people in the pharma industry, in those places, to really believe in the idea and then to have a bigger appetite for taking those risks for maybe 5 years before they realize, oh, what a smart decision they've made 5 years ago. So I do see this trend happening. And then maybe I'm biased because I'm in this field, but I definitely see some changes, and I see welcoming a trend of these new technologies really making way into different areas. But again, it's not a magic button sort of thing. We understand it's really different solutions catered and customized to solve specific problems. And then when we accumulate more evidence of this being of real use, we will definitely see greater adoption of those things moving forward.
Thank you. And there's, we just got a question as well in the Q&A, and is how can we accelerate the adoption of AI for discovery of small drug molecules in Singapore? So saying there's been some recent preclinical breakthroughs, but how do we accelerate this?
I'll add, I think from our community, we are actively looking to expand the recruitment of our own community of professors and postdoctoral researchers to join our institutes And then certainly to once they've kind of developed their research portfolios, to start collaborating more with our surrounding industry partners. And we're starting to see this. I'll say from our perspective, we are getting a lot of outreach from the global community now, from those who have various platforms across, neurodegenerative, oncology, infectious diseases, who do have an interest to build their platforms, say at NUS, and then to collaborate with our local companies. And I think this is driven for many reasons. I think certainly we know we have a vibrant innovation community here. And I think part of this is driven by this commitment, and we're starting to see these success stories of innovations being translated to clinic more, and again, under different contexts, but seeing results of patients actually benefiting. So, I think one way to do it is to actively harness and advocate for this community that we have here to bring in more and to train. The way we train our innovators is evolving as well, right? In biomedical engineering, when I put on my other hat from the education perspective, we are developing programs for our students to add more digital medicine elements to the training of engineers. We know we have students who have capabilities in this space, who have interest in the space. It's also a part of reimagining the educational workflow too.
Thank you. And we are now top of the hour. So thank you, everyone. And I will both to our audience and to our panelists. And I am going to hand it back over to Brian at SGInnovate to close the session.
Thank you so much, Adrian. Thank you to all our speakers today for the insightful and knowledgeable discussion. I think I can speak on SGInnovate's behalf to say that it was a pleasure to have a group of experts like yourself here today to share your insights on such an important topic. So thank you to our audience as well for sharing your questions and posting them for our speakers. Do also take note that we'll be sending out a link to the recording for this session in our bi-weekly newsletter, so do keep an eye out for that. And now with that, we've come to the end of our webinar today. Thank you all for spending your Thursday morning with us. And on behalf of SGInnovate, I would like to wish you all a great week ahead, and we look forward to seeing you again at the next event. Bye, everyone. Thank you so much, everybody.